become leaders, and how they struggle again and again to overcome what he calls, in the quotation from Browning's, the new conditions of oppression. And when he was talking about Jamaica or Guyana or anywhere else then or now, his tendency was to locate all this as part of a global struggle. Even the way he wrote in those last years in Guyana underscores the blurring of lines. As I wrote in a newspaper article called Remembering Walter, he wrote everywhere. In the car if he wasn't driving, standing on the street corner, on the stelling waiting to board the Berbice ferry, waiting for public meetings to begin in Linden, on the quarantine in Leonora in Berbice, often surrounded by the police. He wrote everywhere, I should have added, and running from the police. Almost literally then, as Rupert Ryan puts it, he was fighting as he wrote and writing as he fought. And by that I mean at the same time, within the same space, and with the same driven purpose. Thus the central themes of the last Guyana writings are the central preoccupations of the struggle he helped lead from 1974 to 1980. Resistance, and the critical importance of racial unity to effective resistance. In History of the Guyanese Working People, as in the struggle outside books, his position was that in the worst of times there is resistance even when it is hidden. Thus he began the chapter called Resistance and Accommodation with a dialectic between struggle and accommodation, with struggle ultimately asserting itself as the principal aspect of the contradiction, close quotes. Since there is always resistance, he searched it out in every sector of the working people. Much of his digging into old documents in archives and in people's homes was aimed at finding the invisible makers of history. In this connection, I remember his hunt for the part women played in open acts of resistance. But race was what he was most concerned with, and the chapter not only debunked the myth of Indo-Guyanese docility, but knowing the misuse of this myth, was at pains to explain the material basis why the resistance accommodation dialectic was easier to see in the history of the Indian indentured workers and why African workers of the period had more scope for resistance. The last chapter of A History of the Guyanese Working People, the 1905 riots, is at once a narrative and an analysis of events in 1905, which he had begun by characterizing as much more than riots, until in a fierce exchange of correspondence with El Sogavio, he was reluctantly persuaded that they did not meet the standard of a rebellion. But when you read the chapter, it is clear that although he changed the word in the title, he continued to see the events as having far more weight than would normally be ascribed to riots. The basis of his argument was that in its wide-ranging disaffection, its scale of violence, and the level of consciousness and organization of its participants, what he was now calling riots were more than riots because they shook, if only briefly, the state. In other words, they met his standard of effective resistance, at least for a moment. The racial unity he saw as a product and producer of effective resistance was in the first place between Indo and Afro-Guyanese working people. That was the rupture he believed could be and had to be mended. This was the overriding, though not the only reason why he paid little attention in his writings to the indigenous peoples. In very different ways, all that he wrote and did following his return to Guyana emphasized the unity of Afro and Indo-Guyanese. In Defense of Arnold Rampersad was a deeply personal and emotional speech where he located himself as a Guyanese of African descent, speaking directly to other Guyanese of African descent, admonishing witnesses who had lied on the stand. Arnold Rampersad, looking at age. Arnold Rampersad was an Indo-Guyanese PPP activist who was accused of murdering an Afro-Guyanese policeman. I'm speaking to the two people in the room who are too young to know. So, in Defense of Arnold Rampersad was a deeply personal and emotional speech where he located himself as a Guyanese of African descent, speaking directly to other Guyanese of African descent, admonishing witnesses who had lied on the stand, and appealing to them not to let themselves be used against another working class person of a different race. Facing the crowd at Loiza Row on Durban Street, he began by evoking their proud common history as the children of freed slaves. Now, I am an Afro-Guyanese. There are very many things about what I've been describing against which I rebel. I'm not rebelling just as an abstract citizen. I'm rebelling as a Guyanese with this particular heritage, as an Afro-Guyanese. Whatever else we may have been in our history in this country, we have been a people with dignity. We came out of slavery with dignity, and that was a tremendous achievement because slavery is inherently degrading. But our people came out of slavery and we could stand tall. We fought after slavery to build the villages in this country. We fought to open the interior of this country. Our people, I'm speaking now specifically of the Black Guyanese, whatever may be our shortcomings, have managed to persist in this country with this basis of dignity. Then from the post-slavery period, he came to the present and to the neighborhood where he had spent his childhood, not far from where he was speaking, and which was peopled by women and men he knew would be familiar to his listeners. I was brought up not very far from here, in a typical range yard in Bent Street. And there, amidst the poverty, looking back now, I can see in my mind's eye ordinary Black people who were worth everything, who were human beings, who had strength, who had character. Never mind that he may have been a cartman, never mind the woman may have been taking in washing. When you stop to think of it, they had character. And now I cannot accept that such people must be put to do some dirty skullduggery, coming to court lying to get another man convicted of murder. With far less feeling, but with the same confidence with which he made this appeal, in History of the Guyanese Working People, Rodney refuted the notion of Guyanese history as one that is written with racial conflict. He did not deny the presence of race conflict in 19th century British Guyana. After all, the key chapter on race in the text, chapter 7, is called Race as a Contradiction Among the Working People. And he described how the two groups had been set up against each other and the cultural and residential separations between them. But for him, the argument that the movement towards the race violence of the 1960s was inexorable was simply wrong. For him, quote, communal violence had come about in a context of both local and international class struggle. And he added, quote, the specificity of the early 1960s could hardly be used to characterize the entire history of Guyana. I noticed that when you gave it to the rest, they said, I'm now going to begin to enter the beginning of my conclusion.
I don't wish to be different.
I don't wish to be different. I want to add 2 footnotes to the importance Rodney gave to the unity of Afro and Indo-Guyanese, and briefly draw a conclusion from them. The first is about why he waited until 1974 to return to Guyana. I remember him telling me sometime in the early 1970s when we happened to meet in New York that he would not return to Guyana, or he could not, he said, until he could find a location from which he could contribute to the reuniting of the Indo and Afro-Guyanese working people after the violence of 1961 to 1964. In Walter Rodney Speaks, described by editor Bobby Hill as a text developed from transcripts of conversations held over a 2-day period, April-May 1975 in the United States, Rodney said, quote, the whole history of the 1960s was a history in which our political choices were fundamentally dictated not by any class position, but by the ongoing race conflict. And it made it extremely difficult for any progressive African or Indian to intervene in the Guyanese situation. Because it was already so formed that the moment one intervened, one was doing so in a ready-made context of Indian versus African. And the place, of course, he found was the pre-party Working People's Alliance, which he joined when he came back to Guyana to live. Walter Rodney did not found the pre-party WP, he joined it. And the initial work of moving towards racial unity in fact, was led by Guyana and Moses Bagwan. The second footnote is based on Rodney's preface to Kofi Badu Out of Africa. Unlike his other writing, his children's books did not make the case for racial unity, but were an expression of his focus on the need for racial unity. The preface made this explicit when it said, quote, "The collective effort," he meant of completing the book, "hopes to make a modest contribution to revealing further aspects of our rich and varied heritage, so that the children, at least, might better understand themselves and each other." Rereading those words after his death, and again yesterday, I was struck by the words "at least," and the sense they convey that in 1980, in a period of downturn of the political resistance, his faith in the will of adult Guyanese to racial unity was, even if only for a moment, shaken. The oldest of the generations whom he hoped, quote, "might better understand themselves and each other," are now in their 40s. Unity between Indo and Afro-Guyanese is at its lowest point since the late 1980s. And while there is resistance, as there always is, there is no effective resistance. Rodney's conviction was that in Guyana, racial unity and effective resistance make each other possible. That is what he meant when he wrote in People's Power, No Dictator, the last text he wrote before he was killed, and which was written as a call to action that, quote, the firmest unity is unity in struggle. Writing of an earlier period, 1905, he also saw clearly the role that the state played in maintaining or building new barriers to the unity of the working people. Describing the resistance of 1905 as carried out by Afro-Guyanese, but not anti-Indian, he argued that it was possible that without, quote, direct state intervention, for the first time, the various racial, occupational, and legal barriers within the plantation labor force could have been transcended. I will skip some. I don't want to speak much about today, especially after panel one. But since I claim the continued applicability of Walter Rodney's ideas, I have to make at least a brief reference. Especially among Afro-Guyanese, there is fundamental disagreement with the Rodney early WPA approach, given the development since 1992. And I think it is true that the approach to race unity has to be different from that pursued in the 1970s and 1980s. But I also think that it is true, and as true today, as it was when Rodney was writing and telling and making history, that working to build unity in struggle, in the face of all that militates against it, is a condition of our genuine liberation. Thank you.